Greetings, class. My name is Jay Johnson Grant. I'm currently enrolled in COM 622, like the rest of you, Organizational Communication at Liberty University Online. Today I'm going to be speaking with you about transformational leadership in the public and private sectors. This is the topic that I chose to use for my research paper. So if you click over to the next slide, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what you can expect during this presentation. Oops. Sorry. So here's the overview. First, I'm going to define transformational leadership, and I'm also going to give you the difference between public and private sector organizations. Next, we'll jump into the literature review. There are two different articles that I'll discuss briefly. I'll give you the results that I found for transformational leadership in the organizational sectors, and then we'll do future research, and we'll conclude this presentation. So let's jump right in talking about transformational leadership. Please go to the next slide. Transformational leadership, I'm sure you've heard of it before. It is defined by many, but by Peter Nordhaus as the process whereby a person engages with others and creates a connection that raises the level of motivation and morality in both the leader and the follower. It has four components to this leadership style. That's idealized influence, inspirational motivation, individualized consideration, and intellectual stimulation. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go in depth and expound on what all of those components are, but there's a pretty little chart that lists those, and I'm sure you've heard this before. If not, I'd love to go deeper with you in the discussion about what those components are and more about transformational leadership. Let's go over to the next slide. So we're looking at transformational leadership, and I'm going to call that TL for the rest of this presentation because it's a mouthful. So we're looking at TL in public and private sectors, and I would be remiss if I didn't explain the difference between the two of those before we delve in further. So it's very simple. Public sector organizations, those are government controlled. They deliver public programs, goods, and services that all have to do with government having their hands on it. And private sector organizations, those are part of the country's organization or any country's organizations and economy that's not controlled directly by the government. So public, government, private, no government. There we go. So let's move on. We're going to start talking about the literature review. The first article has to do with the private sector organization. So let's go to the next slide. The first article I did, like I just previously said, was a private sector organization article, and it's called The Effect of Transformational Leadership. I just said I was going to say TL, but I said it all. Transformational Leadership Behavior on Organizational Culture, an Application in Pharmaceutical Industry. So we're looking at a privately owned pharmaceutical industry. You can see on the slide it says the authors and the researchers' names. I'm going to let you attempt to pronounce that. And if you got it down, you let me know in the discussion. So in this article, they had several hypotheses that all surrounded around this, that there would be positive and significant correlations between transformational leadership, TL, and Hofstede's dimensions of culture. There are 6 dimensions of culture, but they're only basing this off of 5 dimensions of culture, the original 5. Those are long-term versus short-term orientation, masculinity versus femininity, power distance, individualism versus collectivism, and uncertainty avoidance. And in order to measure this, they gave out 3 questionnaires. The first questionnaire had to do with demographics of the people who are working within that organization, the pharmaceutical industry. The second questionnaire had to do with how the followers assessed their leader as far as how charismatic and how transformational they perceive their leader to be. And then the last questionnaire had to do with the dimensions of culture and looking at how the followers assess the organizational culture for the organization that they were in. So I'm going to leave you hanging with the results. A little cliffhanger here, but only for 2 slides. We're going to get into the results of how everything turned out after we talk about public sector organizations. So let's go over to the next slide. In the public sector, where the government has their hands on it, remember, this article is called The Effectiveness and Specificity of Change Management in a Public Organization, Transformational Leadership, and a Bureaucratic Organizational Structure. Now, this researcher, Voigt, I'm going to guess, or yeah, Voigt, I think I said that right. his hypothesis was that there would be high levels of transformational leadership, and they would increase effectiveness of planned process to change, but not the effectiveness of emergent process of change, excuse me. So there was a lot that went into this article, but I felt the most important things that one should know for our overview is what a planned process to change is and what an emergent process to change is, because that's what their variables were. So a planned process to change, quite simply put, is a top-down bureaucratic management. It's very structured. It's just structured to the T. So I'm sure you've been in an organization. Actually, a good example I'd probably say would be the military. Structured to the T with the rank system, the hierarchy, everything. You're not just going around ranks and doing stuff like that. Very structured. And an emergent process to change is decentralized and it's flexible. It has a very low bureaucratic structure. I can't give you a specific example right off the top of my head, and I apologize for that. I may have to look through and add something in there later in the discussion board post. But those are the differences. So one's highly structured and bureaucratic, and that's planned, and the emergent is the one where it's a lot more flexible. So again, so they're looking to see how transformational leadership impacts one of the two. And again, Voigt is guessing that transformational leadership is going to increase the effectiveness in a planned process to change organization. So let's go to the next slide. We're going to see the results, cliffhanger ending, of both the public and private sector articles. Results. Let's look at the private sector first. In the private sector, the researchers found that the qualities of transformational leadership did indeed create and maintain stable, supportive, an inspirational organizational environment where employees are able to be successful and contribute to the overall success of an organization. So there was positive and significant correlation between transformational leadership and Hofstede's dimensions of culture. That's exactly what they were looking for. That's exactly what they found. So we're going to move on to the public sector. Now, I'm going to have to say what they did find was the complete opposite of what they were anticipating. This was shocking, but there's actually a good explanation for it. TL did not impact employee willingness to change and plan processes to change, but did have significant impact in emergent processes of change. Now, this is why they assume this is so. Further research actually can research this even more to find out if this is actually an accurate interpretation of what happened. But the guess was from the researcher is that in an organization where it's planned process to change, it's so bureaucratically structured, they didn't necessarily need a transformational leader to help employees have a greater willingness to change and add to the values and culture of the organization. It was already there because they're so structured. But for emergent processes of change within an organization, because they're a lot more flexible, they found that transformational leadership had increasing value there because they did need that structure. They needed someone to push them and motivate them and give them higher morale and that willingness to change that was necessary. So let's move on to the next slide and see how further research can take us even further when we're looking at the public and private sectors and transformational leadership. Okay, so we can look at how transformational leadership impacts employees when it's utilized by the CEO of an organization all the way down to the direct supervisors of an organization. Because at different levels, different leaders have different impacts on their followers, right? So if we look at the CEO and we look at every single leader down and how transformational leadership in each of those levels impacts the employees and the organization as a whole. We can look at the leader gender roles to see if transformational leadership in a male or in a female is going to have positive and significant correlations to those Hofstede dimensions of culture that were discussed in the private sector, actually, as well as implementing that same thing into public sector organizations. And lastly, this was something that didn't take place in either of the research articles. I would guess that we should try to measure change over an extended period of time in the private and public sectors, because that's a key component that was missing to really be able to see how change impacted over an extended period of time. So let's go over to the next slide. In conclusion, what I discussed with you was transformational leadership in public and private sector organizations. I explained the differences between public and private sectors, gave you a brief literature review for my research paper, the results I found, and opportunities for future research. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day.